What up, fam? Pat Slimbound here, and I'm here to talk to you about a Three Sisters planting. Now, right off from the bat, I'm just going to tell you, I haven't actually ever done this before, and a lot of the learning and information gathering I've done has just been through research, watching other YouTube videos, and reading about things. The purpose of me making this video here is to actually, over the next few months, document the progress and the process to kind of help create that learning tool for anyone out there interested in doing this probably next season. I mean, if you're interested in starting it here and now as soon as possible, you can do any other kind of research that I've done as well. But here, I'm experimenting, I'm doing the learning, and I really just want to take you all along on my learning process through this Three Sisters planting. Now, first off, what is that? The Three Sisters planting is a companion planting technique, an agricultural technique that was kind of pioneered and invented by many native tribes across the United States, and it was discovered by the European settlers when they essentially showed up, didn't know how to eat off the land, didn't know anything, and were taught this technique by the various tribes that they encountered that were here. What's particularly interesting about that is different settlers from different times, the Spanish, the English, the French, encountered different tribes in different locations all across the continent that had used and understood this particular planting technique that included the growth of corn or maize, a bean species of some kind, and a squash, typically pumpkin, but not necessarily every time. And what I find interesting about that is that since there was no one single tribe in the history of the Americas that was the owner of this technique, what that sort of tells me over time is that there was a lot of cultural interaction and cross-pollination between the tribes, which we kind of knew and understood anyway, but this is just one of those almost explicit evidences of that particular fact that I find very fascinating and am very interested in. Now, one of the awesome things about this is that there are actually legends and stories that are tied to this, and I actually kind of want to go through one of them here. I'm gonna read it directly from the Oneida Nation's website, and on the Oneida Nation's website, they actually share a particular legend from the Haudenosaunee tribe, and I'm going to kind of pause along the way and share with you some of the interesting thoughts and ideas that come from this, and it ties into how stories and how stories transition and transfer knowledge and knowing amongst civilizations and the people that live in them. So here we go. Very long ago, there were three sisters who lived in a field. The youngest was so small she could not yet walk. She crawled along the ground dressed in green. The middle sister, who wore a bright yellow dress and darted back and forth across the field. The eldest sister stood tall and straight, and her body bent with the wind. She had long yellow hair and wore a green shawl. The three sisters loved one another very much and could not imagine living without the others. Now, right here, there's particular details in this that I think are very significant. If you notice, all of the physical attributes of these sisters that are anthropomorphized actually also mirror and mimic the traits of the plants we're talking about. We have corn, long and tall with yellow hair and a green shawl. We have the squash or pumpkins that zoom back and forth, their vines across the ground, and they wear a bright yellow dress that looks like the flowers. The flowers of these species look like, if you hold them down, look like yellow dresses, and the beans that are very short. One day a little Indian boy came to the field. He was very handsome and knew the ways of the land. He could talk with the birds and the animals and was straight and fearless. The three sisters were very interested in this boy as they had watched him use his stone knife to carve a bowl or hunt with his bow and arrow. And here we are describing possibly a typical person or a representation of the people that were there. Late in the summer of the boys' first visit to the field, the youngest of the three sisters disappeared. She was the one who could only creep along the ground. She could not even stand unless there was a stick she could cling to, but she was gone and the other sisters mourned her until the fall. Now, it's particularly interesting because I related this to the bean, and beans are a climbing species, and they will climb up something if you put a stick or a branch next to them that they can go up along. The Indian boy returned to the field to gather reeds that grew on the edge of a small stream. He used the reeds to make arrow shafts. The two remaining sisters again watched him, fascinated. That night, the second sister disappeared, the one who always wandered hither and yon. Now, there was only one sister left, the tall and straight sister. She did not bow her head in sorrow, though she mourned deeply and thought she could not live in the field without her sisters. As the days grew shorter and colder, her green shawl began to lose its color and her yellow hair became dry and tangled. Night and day she sighed for her sisters, but her voice was low like the wind and no one heard her. One day, in the harvest season, the little Indian boy heard the third sister crying, and he felt sorry for her. He took her in his arms and carried her to his home, and there a delightful surprise awaited her. Her sisters were there in the lodge, safe and very glad to be reunited. They explained that they had been curious about the little Indian boy and had followed him home. And they decided to stay because winter was coming and his home was warm and comfortable. The sisters also were making themselves useful to the boy and his family. The youngest, now all grown up, kept the dinner pot full, while the second sister, still in her yellow dress, dried herself on the shelf so she could fill the dinner pot later in the winter. The eldest sister was so pleased to be with her sisters again and so impressed with the help they gave the boy that she too began drying herself so the family could have meals to use as the winter went on. And from this day, the three sisters were never separated again. Now, what's particularly important about the rest of this is each particular segment or section of this story also coincides with a season or a seasonal moment in which an individual may go and actually harvest these particular crops. Towards the end of the summer is a wonderful time to harvest beans. Next, the squash after that towards the fall, and then deeper. And it says as her shawl dried and she began to sigh in the wind, there's this sort of rustling sighing sound that comes from the dry foliage of a corn stalk. And here's where we get into the really fascinating and interesting element of stories in cultures, particularly the stories of cultures that did not possess writing techniques. These stories are fantastic ways to turn them into narratives, and characters that we identify with are fantastic ways to transfer complex knowledge and process complex ideas deeper on through the generations. And there are other examples of this. Not only were these, allegedly primitive peoples actually utilizing complex and interesting agricultural techniques, but they had a very frankly interesting and complicated way of transferring that knowledge. And if we were to consider other places, say the ancient Pacific Islanders people that were traveling across the oceans in boats, they also did not have written languages but had phenomenal stories that would transfer the deep and intricate astronomical and astrological knowledge that they possessed in order to navigate open seas with no maps or compasses or anything else. And consider also the ancient Celts who built Stonehenge. Stonehenge was a complicated engineering and mathematical marvel tied to the cosmos. Deep, intricate understandings where they built these structures tied to stars and the movements of planets, and they did it all without a written language. I mean, they sort of did, but it was not very complex. A small system of hashes and marks on stone. It wasn't a lot, and it certainly wasn't enough to convey all of the knowledge necessary to build Stonehenge. And consider the ancient cultures of Western Africa, where they had built major cities and agricultural techniques with very limited written language. And how did they do that? Well, they told stories. And this ties closely into the idea of the bard that from one of my previous videos, where the bard was the sacred and integral keeper of knowledge and stories and math and politics and law. And so what we see here is this very practical story that we can implement in our lives today in our own gardens to feed ourselves and our families, that actually stems from a very ancient system of knowledge and knowing called the story. So let's check to the table, and I'll walk you through my particular seed selection, why I chose them, and kind of the thought process I went through that. And then I'll actually go through preparing the soil here in order to make a couple of planting mounds in order to start with the corn first. Okay, so these are the seeds that I have chosen. Now, through the research that I had done, there were a broad range of recommendations of seeds that would work, or techniques or approaches that one should take in order to have a successful planting with this Three Sisters method. And through all of my research, one of the things that a conclusion that I sort of came to was there's a certain amount of experimentation or guesswork that may go involved with this, because the general structure or diagram of the planting is actually going to be more or less the same, though there are a few techniques that I found through my research there. But when it comes to the recommendations, they ranged almost entire from everything from do it exactly as the natives did, where you only plant those native species of corn, beans, and squash like maize and whatever else the other beans were, to kind of pick whatever corn you want, pick whatever kind of squash you want, pick whatever kind of bean you want as long as it climbs. And so it needs to be maize and pumpkins and a kidney bean essentially, or pick whatever you want. And so what I kind of figured was I didn't see a lot of information on Three Sisters plantings in my specific area and how those would affect. And so what I gathered was essentially a lot of this kind of depends on where you're planting, the environmental conditions and everything else. So I kind of made my own personal judgments on how I wanted to approach it based on what I thought would grow, what was available to me in my seed stores, and what I wanted to eat in general. So I went with the early Summer Glow hybrid sweet corn. We'll see how that turns out. I went with Garden Bean Bush Blue Lake 274. This is actually a very specific species that I saw recommended through multiple sites. And I went with Summer Squash. I don't know how well these will work, and if some of you out there have tried this and have information you can give on how well this will or will not work, please share. This year of planting for me is going to be somewhat of a toss-up, and we'll see how it goes. So I'll start with the corn, the sister corn. She needs to be planted first, then it will be followed by the pole bean that will then climb up the stalks of the corn itself, and then after that the summer squash, which will then sprout and spread out and cover the ground below the other two sisters. So let's get that mound prepared and check it out. Of the mounds, I wanted to talk about my soil here, as well as a couple of the variety of techniques. There were techniques where you could have small mounds in rows that would have corn in the middle and beans on the outside. There were techniques that showed large fields where you could plant multiple of them kind of surrounding each other. The one I'm going with are going to be 2 4-foot wide mounds here and there, where there will be corn in the center, the beans around the outside there, and then a few squash strategically planted in the kind of no longer on the mound spots on the outsides of those. This soil here that I have has spent a couple of years under a large mulch pile. Much of the leaves that have fallen from our tree we just raked and gathered and piled here, and it created this fantastic earthen loamy soil. One of the things I did have to do though was there was a huge root mat that had spread out beneath this particular soil area that was tied to my maple tree here, and so I did dig that up. And when I mean a mat, it was like a full carpet. I was just digging and pulling up huge chunks. And what you see here, this is actually pine wood shavings with chicken poop in it, because this has been the bedding of our cage that we've been keeping our chicks in as they grow, and we're preparing them to go into their coop in a couple of weeks here. So I'm going to get this all turned up and mixed in and turned into 2 mounds, one right here and one a little deeper back, and then I'll plant in the seed. Okay, so now I've got this nice loose loamy pile here, and what I'm gonna do, they recommend planting them about an inch deep, kind of around the circle, as well as somewhere between 6 and 10 inches apart. So on my hori, I've got these awesome inch markers. What I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna kind of pick my first spot right here, get it about an inch deep, checking out that mark on the hori. I'm gonna lay it down and come over here. This whole thing is about 9 inches across. So if I come over to this spot, I got another one, boom, throwing it down. It's about an inch deep. There we go. Coming around again, here's another, boom, awesome little spot, about an inch deep. Back over, this little spot, about an inch deep. And my first one was somewhere over here. Maybe I'll throw in another just for good measure, just to see. Okay, so I got those there. I'll get them watered in. A lot of things I saw recommended having a bowl in the middle, and it's entirely possible that I planted these too far away. The bowl kind of intended to be helping for watering purposes and maintaining the, kind of a deal. So it's possible I could have moved them a little closer, but I think I'm in a decent range there to where the root systems will expand, and this will make a great watering source for them there. After that's said and done, I'll come down from where the things are growing, bean, all the way around, and then out farther is where I'll put the squash. So now we just gotta wait. Thanks for checking it out, and we'll see you guys in a few weeks.